Somewhere in the dark above you, a small blue world is turning, the way it has turned for billions of years, slow and patient and sure. You are riding on it right now, held in place by nothing you can see, carried through the night without a sound. Tonight, we are going to explore the only home our kind has ever known, the planet beneath your feet, and the astonishing way it learned to stay alive. Scientists have pieced together its long memory, and what they have found is stranger than any story we could invent. This world has been struck by another planet and survived it. It is frozen over almost from pole to pole and thawed again. It has lost nearly all of its living things more than once and filled itself back up with life. And still, it turns. How does a single world endure so much and keep going? Where did the air you are breathing right now actually come from? And who made it? And why is it that the worst days in the history of this planet, the days of fire and ice and ruin, were also the days that quietly cleared the way for everything we love? Until you finally understand that we are here because of the disasters, not in spite of them. If you find a soft comfort in drifting off to the deep history of distant times and the quiet wonders of your own world, you might gently tap the like button or follow along, so these long, calm journeys can find you again on another night. Now, let's dive in. To understand how Earth survived, we have to go back further than almost anything the mind can hold. Not hundreds of years, not thousands, not even millions. We have to go back about 4.5 billion years, to a time before the planet existed at all, before there was any ground to stand on or any sky to look up into. There is a useful trick for feeling a number that large. Imagine that the whole history of the Earth is pressed into a single calendar year, beginning at midnight on the 1st of January. On that scale, all of recorded human history, every king and every war and every song ever written down, fits into the last few seconds before midnight on the 31st of December. Everything else, all the rest of the year, belongs to the story we are about to follow. So when we say 1 billion years, try not to rush past it. Let it stretch out. We have all the time in the world. And you might wonder, lying here in the dark, how anyone could possibly know about a time so impossibly long ago, a time before there were any eyes to see it or any voices to write it down. It is a fair question, and the answer is itself a quiet wonder. We know because the earth keeps a record of itself, written not in words but in stone. Every layer of rock is a page. The deepest layers were laid down first, long ago, and newer layers settled on top of them, year after year, age after age. The way leaves settle on a forest floor or dust settles on a shelf. Read from the bottom up. The rock tells the story of the world in order, and a patient eye can learn to read it. For most of human history, we did not understand this. People looked at the hills and the cliffs and assumed they had always been just so, that the world was only as old as the oldest stories anyone could remember. But a little over 200 years ago, in Scotland, a thoughtful man named James Hutton spent his days walking the coast and the river banks, looking closely at the rock. And slowly, a startling idea took hold of him. He saw layers that had once been flat mud at the bottom of a sea, now lifted and tilted and standing on end, with newer layers laid across the broken tops of the old. For that to happen, an entire world of mud would have had to harden into stone, then be raised up and worn down, then drowned and buried again, all before the newer rock was even laid. No flood, no single event could do that. It would take an amount of time that staggered the mind. Hutton realized that the Earth was not thousands of years old, as people had long believed. It was older than anyone had dared to imagine, so old that looking back through its history was like looking down a well so deep you could not see the bottom. That idea, that the Earth has a past stretching back almost beyond comprehension, is what scientists now call deep time. And getting used to it is the first thing anyone must do to understand our story. It is also, in its own way, a deeply restful idea. The world is patient beyond all telling. It has been here, turning and changing, for so long that all of human worry put together is a single breath in a life that has lasted forever. So let yourself sink into that depth tonight. We are about to fall a very long way back into it. In the beginning, in our small corner of the galaxy, there was no sun and no earth. There was only a vast, cold, thin cloud of gas and dust, drifting in the dark between the stars. It was unimaginably large and almost unimaginably empty, mostly hydrogen, the simplest and oldest material there is, left over from the birth of the universe itself. For a very long time, nothing much happened. The cloud simply drifted, and then, somewhere inside it, perhaps nudged by the shock wave of a dying star far away, a little bit of that cloud began to lean inward, pulled gently together by its own faint gravity. That is all it took, a small clumping in the dark. Once it began, it did not stop. The more the cloud drew together, the stronger its pull became. And the stronger its pull became, the more it drew together. It began to spin, slowly at first, the way water turns as it drains. And as it spun, it flattened into a wide swirling disk with a thickening heart at the center. In that heart, the gas was squeezed tighter and tighter, and as it squeezed, it grew hot. Hotter than rock, hotter than iron, hotter than anything you have ever felt or seen. And then, at the very center, something switched on. The pressure and the heat grew so extreme that the hydrogen atoms could no longer keep their distance from one another. They were forced together, fused into a heavier element called helium, and that joining released a flood of energy. A new light kindled in the dark. Our sun was born. It did not arrive gently. It came on like a furnace catching all at once. And from that moment, the center of our little corner of space was no longer cold. It was a star, and it would go on burning, steady and bright, for billions of years to come, long enough for everything else in this story to happen. But the sun did not use up all of the cloud. Far out in the spinning disk, well beyond the new fire at the center, there was still a great deal of material left over, gas and dust and tiny grains of ice and rock, all turning together in the same slow wheel. And here is where your world begins, not with a bang, but with a kind of quiet gathering, the little grains, drifting in their orbits, began to bump into one another. When they touched softly enough, they stuck. A speck joined a speck. A clump joined a clump. Over a very long time, these gentle collisions built larger and larger bodies, the way a snowball grows as it rolls. Scientists sometimes call these growing bodies the seedlings of the planets. In the cold outer reaches of the disk, far from the sun, the seedlings gathered up enormous amounts of ice and gas, and they swelled into the giant planets, the worlds of swirling cloud that we now know as Jupiter and Saturn and the others. But closer in, where the young sun shone hot, the ice could not survive. Only rock and metal could hold together in that warmth. And so the inner seedlings, the ones near the fire, were built of sterner stuff. They became the small, hard, rocky worlds. Mars was one of them, and one of them was Earth. The young Earth was not the calm blue planet you picture when you close your eyes. It was a world of molten rock and relentless violence, glowing in places like a coal pulled from a fire. It was still growing, still sweeping up the leftover rubble of its orbit. And every piece of rubble that fell arrived as another impact, another burst of heat. Its surface churned. Volcanoes opened everywhere, more than you could ever count, and they breathed out thick gases from deep inside the planet. Gases like hydrogen sulfide and methane and carbon dioxide. These exhalations gathered into the first atmosphere our world ever had. It was nothing you could have breathed. There was no oxygen in it at all. It was a hot, heavy, poisonous shroud wrapped around a ball of fire, and from above, the bombardment continued. Asteroids and comets, the last of the unswept debris, came down again and again, lighting the sky. It is worth pausing here on this hot and battered young world, because already you can feel the shape of the whole story arriving. This is a planet being beaten into existence. Every blow is shaping it, and the single greatest blow was still to come. Imagine the young Earth, perhaps 50 million years old, sharing its lane around the sun with another world. This second world had a name given to it by scientists much later. They call it Theia. It was no small thing. Theia was roughly the size of the planet Mars, which is to say, it was about half as wide across as the Earth, a genuine planet in its own right. For a while, the two worlds circled the same sun on nearly the same path, and there is something almost peaceful in picturing them. Two young planets keeping their distance. But their orbits were not stable. Slowly, over ages, they drifted toward the same point in space at the same time. And then they met. Theia struck the young Earth in what may be the most violent single event our planet has ever known. This was not a crater. This was not a wound that healed over. This was two worlds colliding. The impact released so much energy that a great part of both planets melted and was thrown up and out, flung into a glowing ring of debris that wrapped all the way around the Earth. For a time, our world wore a halo of its own shattered rock, a bright band of molten material turning slowly overhead. And then gravity, the same patient force that had built the planets in the first place, went to work again. The debris in that ring began to gather, clump by clump, the way the planets themselves had gathered, and out of the ruin of a collision that should have destroyed everything, something new was assembled in the sky. The moon. Take that in for a moment, because it sets the tone for all that follows. The moon that steadies our seasons, the moon that pulls the tides, the soft silver light that has watched over every night of human history, was born from a catastrophe. The worst day in the early life of our planet gave us our closest companion in space. This will happen again and again in this story. Ruin and gift will turn out to be the same event, seen from different distances in time. Keep that quietly in mind as we go on. And the moon was not only beautiful, it became, over the ages, one of the quiet keepers of the world. It is the moon, with its steady pull, that raises the tides in our seas, the slow daily breathing of the oceans in and out along every shore. Some scientists think those very tides, washing back and forth over the early coasts, mixing the waters and the chemistry of the young world, may have helped life find its first footing. And the moon does something gentler still. As the earth turns, it wobbles slightly, the way a spinning top leans and rights itself, and the moon's patient gravity holds that wobble steady, keeping the seasons mild and regular rather than wild and lurching. Without the moon, our weather might swing to terrible extremes. With it, the world keeps a calm and even rhythm, the kind of steady world in which slow life can thrive. So the soft light you have seen on 1,000 quiet nights is not only a companion, it is a steadying hand, born from the worst day of the early earth, and holding the planet gently level ever since. It is, in its way, about 240,000 miles away, and yet it touches the sea every single day. After the Great Collision, the Earth was hotter than ever, and for a long stretch, it remained a place no living thing could have endured. There were no oceans. It was far too hot for that. Any water on the planet existed only as vapor, a scalding steam held in that thick early air, because liquid water cannot survive on a surface that glows. And so for ages the young world simply cooled. There is nothing dramatic to describe here, and that is the point. It cooled the way a stone pulled from a fire cools, slowly, without hurry, giving up its heat to the dark of space one long day at a time. Patience is not a virtue we usually grant to a planet, but patience is exactly what this part of the story is made of. Nothing was rushing. Nothing needed to. The earth had nowhere to be. And then, after enough time had passed, the air grew cool enough for a quiet miracle. The water vapor in the sky could finally gather into droplets. It began to rain. We do not know how long the rains lasted, but they may have continued for a very long time, falling and falling onto rock that had never known a drop of liquid, filling the low places, spreading across the cooling crust. About 3.8 billion years ago, the surface of the earth had cooled enough that the water no longer boiled away. It pooled, it deepened, it joined. and the first true ocean was born. A single, vast, primitive sea. Until much of the young planet was wrapped in water, and our world became, for a time, almost entirely a water world. This matters more than almost anything else we will say tonight. And it is worth slowing down to say why. Water is not just scenery. Water is the one ingredient that life, as far as we know, cannot do without. It is the place where the small pieces of the living world can float and meet and join together. So when the oceans appeared, the stage was set. And on that stage, about 3.7 billion years ago, in the warm dark of the early sea, something happened that has never been fully explained, and may be the most important event in the entire history of the planet. Life appeared. These first living things were nothing you would recognize as alive. There were no plants, no animals, no leaves, no eyes. There were only tiny single specks of life, so small that millions of them could rest on the head of a pin, drifting in the early sea. They had no thoughts and no plans. They did only two things. They held themselves together against the wearing down of the world, and they made copies of themselves. That is all life was, at the start. A small pattern that could keep itself going and pass itself on. And yet from that simple beginning, everything else descends, including you, lying here in the dark, listening. Every creature that has ever lived is a distant cousin of those first faint specks in the warm, primitive ocean. How did it begin? This is one of the great unanswered questions. And there is something fitting about ending up at a mystery in the middle of a story about a planet. We can describe the world that life appeared in. We can list the ingredients that were present, the water and the simple chemistry and the warmth of the young earth. Perhaps near the hot vents on the deep sea floor, where minerals and heat and water all met together. But the exact moment, the precise step where a collection of ordinary chemistry first crossed over into something that could feed and grow and copy itself, that step still hides from us. We know that it happened because we are here. We do not fully know how, and rather than finding that unsettling, you might find it rather lovely, lying here tonight, that the beginning of everything living, including you, is still wrapped in a gentle mystery that no one has fully unwrapped. What we do know is that it only had to happen once. As far as anyone can tell, every living thing on Earth, every bacterium and blade of grass, every fish and bird and tree, every dinosaur that ever roared, and every person who has ever drawn breath, descends from a single shared origin in that ancient sea. We are all, in the most literal way, one enormous family, branching and branching across billions of years from a single root. The dinosaurs are distant relatives. The trees outside your window are distant relatives. The bacteria that helped make the air are distant relatives. When you breathe out tonight, you are returning carbon to the same great cycle that those first creatures set in motion. You are not separate from the story of the earth. You are made entirely of it, and you always have been. For an immense stretch of time after that, the world stayed quiet. This is one of the strangest facts in the whole story, and one of the easiest to miss. Life began very early, but it stayed simple for an extraordinarily long time, well over 1 billion years, longer than the entire age of complex life that would follow. If you find yourself impatient for something to happen, sit with that for more than 1,000 million years. The living world was content to remain microscopic, floating, dividing, slowly changing in ways too small to see. The Earth was in no hurry to become interesting. It was simply being itself. But under that slow surface, the small creatures of the sea were quietly inventing the future. Around 2.5 billion years ago, give or take. Certain of these tiny organisms learned a brand new trick, and it changed the planet forever. We call them cyanobacteria, and what they discovered was how to catch sunlight and use its energy to feed themselves, taking in the carbon dioxide of that old air and the water of the sea and building their own bodies out of them. Today, we call this process photosynthesis, and it is the same thing every green leaf on Earth still does. But photosynthesis has a leftover, a waste gas that these tiny creatures simply released and did not need. That waste gas was oxygen. At first, it made no difference. The new oxygen was swallowed up by the rocks and the iron in the sea, rusting them, vanishing as fast as it was made. But the cyanobacteria kept at it, year after year, age after age, releasing their oxygen into a world that had never held any. And eventually, the rocks and the seas could absorb no more. The oxygen began to build up. It spilled into the sky. Over a very long time, it filled the whole atmosphere, until the poisonous old air of the early Earth was slowly replaced by air with oxygen in it. The beginning of the air that you are breathing this very moment. We sometimes call this the great change in the air. It was caused not by anything grand or sudden, but by countless invisible creatures, each one impossibly small, all doing the same quiet thing for an unthinkable length of time. The world we live in was built by patience. And yet, like so much in this story, the gift came wrapped in disaster. For the creatures of that ancient world, oxygen was not a blessing. To most of them, it was a poison, a strange and corrosive new gas flooding their home. Many kinds of early life could not bear it, and they died away in enormous numbers. It may have been one of the largest die-offs the planet has ever seen, and it was caused by life itself, by the very success of the little oxygen makers. The world was learning a hard lesson it would teach over and over again. What saves one age can undo another. There was a second consequence, too, and it was felt not in the sea but in the sky. The old, thick blanket of carbon dioxide that had kept the young Earth warm was now being thinned out, used up by the spreading life and the changing chemistry of the air. And carbon dioxide is a warming gas. Take away enough of it, and a planet grows cold. So the Earth grew cold, not a little cold, bitterly, deeply, almost unimaginably cold. The temperature fell and kept falling, and the ice spread down from the poles, sheet upon sheet, further than it had ever reached. Much of the young world froze over in the first great ice age in its history. an age so severe that some scientists picture nearly the entire planet wrapped in white, a pale frozen marble turning silently around the sun. It would be easy to think that this was the end, that a frozen planet is a dead planet. But the Earth survived even this. Deep beneath the ice, the volcanoes never stopped breathing. Slowly, over millions of years, they returned carbon dioxide to the air. The warming blanket thickened again, and the ice loosened its grip and pulled back toward the poles. The world thawed. Life, which had been hiding in the warm places, in the deep sea and around the volcanic vents, came back into the open, and so the planet learned another of its survival tricks. It does not stay in any one state forever. It swings. It overheats, and it overcools. It floods and it freezes. And each time it eventually finds its way back toward the middle, carried by the slow machinery of fire and rock and water that never switches off. While the air and the ice were changing, the ground itself was on the move. In the very early days, there had been almost no dry land at all, only that endless, primitive ocean. But beneath the waves, the planet was busy. Molten rock rose and cooled, lighter material gathered and floated, and at last the first true patches of land began to push up above the surface of the sea. Scientists call these oldest cores of land cratons. They are the ancient hearts of the continents, and astonishingly, pieces of them still exist today, buried inside the land you may have walked on. Rock so old it has been here for billions of years. As more and more of this land rose from the ocean, the scattered pieces began to drift together, and the Earth assembled its first great landmass. Its name is Valbara. We should be honest about it. As supercontinents go, Valbara was modest, smaller, scientists think, than the continent of Australia is today. It was less a mighty supercontinent than a first rough draft, an early attempt by the planet at gathering its land into one place. But it mattered, because it was the beginning of a slow rhythm that has shaped the world ever since. The continents are not fixed. They never have been. They ride on the slow currents of the hot rock beneath them, drifting at about the speed your fingernails grow, gathering together over hundreds of millions of years into one great mass, then breaking apart again, then gathering once more. This gathering and breaking is one of the deepest heartbeats of the planet, far too slow for any single creature to feel, but never, ever still. Over the ages that followed, the land kept drifting and joining and parting. After Valbara came other arrangements, and eventually the pieces gathered into a far grander landmass than the first. This one was called Rodinia, and it was a true supercontinent, perhaps among the largest that has ever existed, a single enormous expanse of land sitting in a single enormous sea. Picture standing on its shore. You could have walked inland for thousands of miles and never reached the far side. And around the time Rodinia ruled the surface, life, after all those long, quiet ages of staying small, finally began to grow more complicated. Single specks started living together. Simple bodies, made of many parts working as one. began to appear in the sea. The living world was, very slowly, learning to be more than microscopic. But the planet does not let any arrangement last. Rodinia, vast as it was, broke apart, its pieces drifting off across the globe, and in time they gathered again into yet another supercontinent, this one called Pannotia. And it was around the breaking and reforming of these great land masses, in the shallow seas along their shifting coasts, that life on Earth did something it had never done before. It exploded. Between about 540 and 485 million years ago, in a stretch of time we now call the Cambrian explosion, the seas suddenly filled with an astonishing variety of new living things. After billions of years of small, soft, simple life, the world seemed to bloom all at once. Creatures grew larger, they grew stranger, and for the first time, many of them grew hard parts, shells and plates and spines, armor and structure that soft early life had never possessed. This was a turning point you can almost hold in your hand, because hard parts are the parts that last. They sink into the mud, they turn to stone, and they wait for millions of years to be found. Much of what we know about ancient life, we know because the Cambrian creatures finally had bones and shells to leave behind. The most famous of all these early armored creatures were the trilobites. If you have ever seen their fossils, pressed flat into gray stone, you know how otherworldly they look, like something dreamed rather than something real. Their bodies ridged and segmented, their wide eyes built from tiny crystals of stone. Trilobites crawled and swam through the ancient seas in countless kinds. And they were so successful, so well suited to their world, that they lasted not for thousands of years and not for millions, but for hundreds of millions of years, far longer than any mammal has yet managed. The next time you feel that the world moves too fast, remember the trilobite, quietly thriving in the warm shallows for an almost endless run of time. But the warm shallows did not stay warm. Around 440 million years ago, the climate of the Earth shifted again. The way it always eventually does. The temperature of the ocean changed sharply. The seas cooled. Ice gathered once more, and the gentle conditions in which so much life had spread were suddenly gone, and the world saw something it had never seen on this scale before. A true mass extinction, the first of several great dyings to come. This one, at the end of the Ordovician period, swept away a huge share of all the living things on the planet. Whole families of creatures that had filled the seas simply vanished, gone from the story, never to return. It is a heavy thing to sit with, that so much life can be lost. But here, once more, the deeper pattern shows itself. The creatures that survived, the ones that managed to endure the cold and the change, were the foundation on which everything after them was built. The ecosystems we know today, the great web of who eats whom and who lives where, were laid down by the survivors of ancient catastrophes. Every extinction cleared a space, and into the cleared space, life poured again, reshaped, renewed, often bolder than before. The planet was not being emptied. It was being edited. There is a strange comfort hidden in the fossils of the survivors, and it is worth pausing on before we move to dry land. Picture a single small creature in those ancient seas, living through the cold that killed so much around it. It did not know it was special. It did not know it was a survivor, or a foundation, or an ancestor of anything. It simply did what living things do. It endured one more day, and then another, and then another, through hard times that must have seemed, if it could have thought at all, like the end of the world. And because it kept going, quietly, without any grand plan, whole kingdoms of life that came after it owe their existence to its stubborn, ordinary persistence. There is something in that worth remembering on your own difficult days. You do not have to know what you are building. You do not have to feel strong or certain. You only have to keep going, one ordinary day at a time. The whole history of life is, in the end, made of exactly that, of small creatures who simply did not stop. And life, having mastered the sea, was about to attempt something extraordinary. It was going to leave the water altogether. Somewhere between about 420 and 350 million years ago, the land, which had been bare rock and mud for the entire history of the earth, began to turn green. The first true plants took hold along the water's edge and crept inland. And in time the first trees rose from the soil, tall and strange in a world that had never known a forest. And where the plants led, the animals followed. Small creatures hauled themselves up out of the shallows on stubby limbs, learned to breathe the open air, and became the first animals to live their lives on dry land. The world above the waves, silent and empty since the beginning of time, began at last to fill with living things. And those first great forests did something whose echo reaches all the way into our own age, into the very air of tonight. For a long stretch, the land was covered in enormous swampy forests of strange tall plants, growing thick and fast in the warm, wet air, drinking in carbon dioxide as they grew. When they died, many of them fell into the waterlogged ground and did not fully rot away. They were buried, layer upon layer, pressed down by the weight of more growth above, and over countless ages the heat and the pressure deep in the earth slowly turned those buried forests into coal. The same thing, in different ways, happened to vast quantities of tiny sea creatures, whose remains became the oil and the gas locked far beneath the surface. In other words, the energy of ancient sunlight, captured by living things hundreds of millions of years ago, was quietly stored away inside the planet and forgotten. It would lie there, untouched. Through the rise and fall of the dinosaurs, through the coming of the mammals, through the entire history of humankind, until, only a few generations ago, we would learn to dig it up and burn it. The warmth that runs much of our world today is, quite literally, ancient sunlight, set aside by forests that died before the first dinosaur was born. Hold that thought lightly. It will matter, very gently. near the end of our story. By about 250 million years ago, the restless continents had gathered themselves one more time into a single mighty landmass, the last great supercontinent in our story, and the one whose name you are most likely to know, Pangaea. It was a colossal thing, nearly all the land on Earth fused into one, stretching from the far north to the far south, surrounded by one immense world ocean. On Pangaea, you could in principle have walked from what is now the chill of the polar regions to what is now the heart of the tropics without ever crossing the sea. The interior of such a vast landmass would have been harsh and dry, a baking continental desert, far from any softening coast. But its edges teemed with life, and the world, for a while, settled into a kind of grand stability. And then came the worst day the living world has ever known. Around the time of Pangaea, the Earth suffered the greatest mass extinction in its entire history. A catastrophe so severe that scientists have given it a plain and terrible name. They call it the Great Dying. It was not an asteroid this time. The leading explanation points to something that began deep within the Earth. An enormous and prolonged outpouring of volcanic activity, vast floods of molten rock breaking through the surface and continuing for an immense span of time. These eruptions poured staggering amounts of greenhouse gases into the air, and the planet warmed violently and quickly. The oceans turned hostile to life, and the chemistry of the whole world tilted toward death. When it was over, about 9 in every 10 species on Earth were gone, not 9 in 10 individuals. 9 in 10 kinds of living thing erased. The seas fell nearly silent. The land emptied. Life on Earth came as close as it has ever come to ending entirely. Sit with how close that was, 90%. After 3.5 billion years of building, the living world was very nearly extinguished by its own planet. And yet, even then, it did not all end. A remnant survived. In the cracks and the corners, in the deep sea and the sheltered places, some kinds of creature held on through the long disaster, and when at last the eruption ceased, and the air slowly cleared, and the world began, as it always does, to find its way back toward balance, those survivors inherited an almost empty Earth, and here, one last time. The deepest pattern of this story comes fully into the light. The Great Dying. The very worst thing that ever happened to life on this planet. Swept the stage clear for the most famous creatures that have ever walked it. Because out of the survivors of that catastrophe, in the warming world that followed, a new kind of animal arose, the dinosaurs. Around 240 to 230 million years ago, the first dinosaurs appeared, small and unremarkable at the start, easy to overlook among the other creatures of the recovering world. But they had time, and time is the great sculptor of this story. For the next 150 million years, an almost incomprehensible stretch, The dinosaurs ruled the land. Try to hold that number honestly. 150 million years. Our own kind, in anything like our present form, has existed for only a few 100,000. The dinosaurs reigned for hundreds of times longer than humans have so much as existed. They were not a brief chapter. They were the longest-running story the land has ever told. It is worth dwelling here for a moment, in the long, warm afternoon of the dinosaurs, because there is something deeply restful about that vast stretch of stability. For tens of millions of years at a time, the world simply continued. The seasons turned. The great forests, full of ferns and tall cone-bearing trees, grew and dropped their needles and grew again. Herds of giant plant-eaters moved slowly across the land, their long necks sweeping the high branches, and the small creatures of the underbrush went about their hidden lives, and the rivers ran to the sea, and the sea rolled onto the shore, day after day after day, for longer than the mind can really hold. There were no calendars and no clocks. There was only the slow, even breathing of a world at peace with itself. If you could have walked through one of those ancient forests, you would have found it strange in its details. The plants unfamiliar, the animals enormous, but you would also have found something you might recognize. A warm, green quiet. A world taking its time. The dinosaurs did not know they were living in a golden age, any more than we always know it of our own days. They simply lived, generation after generation, under a sky that gave no sign of changing. And what creatures lived in that long quiet? If you could stand on that ancient land, you would see giants beyond anything alive today. There was the great long-necked sauropod called Argentinosaurus, one of the largest land animals ever to have lived, so enormous that the ground itself must have trembled as it moved. A single animal as long as several school buses parked end to end, browsing the treetops the way a deer browses a bush. And there were the hunters. You might have heard, in the green shadow of the forest, the heavy footfall of one of the most fearsome predators the land has ever produced. The Tyrannosaurus rex, a creature with jaws strong enough to crush bone, walking the world as if it owned it. For 150 million years, this was simply how the earth was, warm, green, vast, and ruled by reptiles. During all this long reign, the ground beneath the dinosaurs was quietly moving once more. Pangaea, the great single continent, had begun to break apart, splitting along enormous cracks, its pieces drifting slowly away from one another across the face of the planet. Over tens of millions of years, those drifting pieces took on shapes that would, in time, become familiar. The outlines of the continents we know today, the ones printed on every map and spun on every globe, were being drawn, one slow inch at a time, while the dinosaurs lived out their long afternoon. The world was rearranging itself around them, and they never knew. And then came the day. You may already sense where this is heading, because in some quiet way, almost everyone knows this part of the story, even if they have never been told the details. About 66 million years ago, A single object came down out of the sky and changed everything. It was an asteroid. A mountain of rock and metal left over from the building of the solar system. And it had been falling, in its own way, for a very long time. It struck the Earth in what is now the country of Mexico, near the edge of a peninsula called the Yucatan, and the blow was beyond anything the living world had faced since the Great Dying. It dug a crater so wide that you could not have crossed it in a day. It threw a colossal cloud of pulverized rock and dust high into the atmosphere, so much that it spread around the entire globe and hung there, blotting out the sun. The world went dark. We will slow down here, because this moment deserves it, and because it is the heart of one of the most remarkable detective stories in all of science. For a long time, no one knew why the dinosaurs had vanished. Their bones were everywhere in the rock, vast and unmistakable. And then, at a certain layer, they simply stopped. Above that line, no dinosaurs. Below it, a world full of them. Something had happened. Sharp and sudden and worldwide, and for the better part of a century. The smartest people who studied the Earth could only guess at what it was. The answer, when it finally came, arrived through the patient work of a father and a son. In the 1970s, a geologist named Walter Alvarez was studying layers of ancient rock in the hills near a small town in Italy. Rock, to a trained eye, is a kind of book, and Walter was reading the pages laid down around the time the dinosaurs disappeared. And there, exactly at the line that marked the end of their world, he found something odd. A thin band of clay, just a finger's width thick, sitting quietly between the ages like a bookmark slipped into the stone. Below it, the rock was full of tiny fossils. Above it, they were gone. Whatever had ended the age of dinosaurs was written into that thin gray layer. The trouble was reading it. So Walter did what people do when they are stuck. He asked for help. And the help he asked for was his own father. His father was Luis Alvarez, a physicist who had won the highest honors in his field. A man used to thinking about the world in terms of atoms and energy. Together they had an idea. They would measure, in that thin clay layer, the amount of a rare metal called iridium. Here is why that was clever. And it is the kind of simple, beautiful reasoning that makes science feel like magic. Iridium is extremely rare in the rocks of the Earth's surface, but it is far more common in the stuff that falls from space, in asteroids and meteorites, the leftover rubble of the solar system. So a normal layer of clay should hold almost no iridium at all. Unless, of course, something from space had come down and spread itself across the whole world. They made the measurement, and the thin clay layer was not low in iridium, it was loaded with it, far more than any earthly process could explain. And the same strange enrichment turned up at that same layer in rock after rock, in country after country, all around the globe. There was only one source large enough to scatter that much space metal evenly across the entire planet. Something enormous had struck the Earth. In 1980, the father and son put forward their idea to the world. The dinosaurs, they argued, had not faded away slowly. They had been ended by a single catastrophe from the sky. Now here is the part of the story that matters most, the part that makes it a human story and not just a scientific one. Almost no one believed them. The idea seemed too sudden, too violent, too much like a tall tale. Many serious scientists, who had spent their lives studying the slow and gradual changes of the Earth, simply could not accept that the grand drama of the dinosaurs had ended in an afternoon. For roughly 10 years, the Alvarez idea was argued over, doubted, and often dismissed. Imagine carrying a true thing in your hands and being told, again and again, by people you respect, that you must be mistaken. That is the quiet burden that so often comes before a great discovery is accepted. The evidence was real, but the world was not ready to read it. What finally turned the tide was the discovery of the wound itself. If a giant asteroid had struck the Earth, it should have left a crater, an enormous one. For years, no one could find it. And then, slowly, the pieces came together, hidden beneath the surface near the Yucatan, buried under layers of younger rock and the waters of the sea. Geophysicists traced the faint, vast, circular shape of a colossal crater, well over 100 miles across, exactly the right age, exactly the right size, exactly where a world-ending impact should have left its mark. It had been there all along, too big to see. The way you can stand inside a valley and never realize you are standing in a bowl. They named it for a nearby village, Chicxulub. The wound matched the wound the thin clay layer had predicted. The father and son had been right. Let us go back, gently, to the day itself, and tell it slowly. The way you might tell a hard story to someone you love, without rushing and without fear. Because it happened so very long ago, and we are only remembering it now. On an ordinary morning, 66 million years ago. The dinosaurs were doing what they had done for 150 million years. They were eating and resting and raising their young in a warm green world that had no reason to expect the sky to change. The asteroid that was coming for them was perhaps 6 miles wide, a single piece of rock larger than a mountain. And it was falling toward the Earth at a speed almost too great to imagine, many miles every second, far faster than any rifle shot. From the ground, in its final moment, it would have brightened into a second sun, and then it touched the Earth. And the world we have been describing for billions of years came apart in an instant. The impact released more energy than all the weapons ever built by humankind combined, many times over. It carved out the great crater in a heartbeat and flung a wall of rock and fire outward across the land. It sent waves through the ocean unlike anything in the planet's memory. And worst of all, for the long term, it threw an immense veil of dust and tiny droplets high into the sky, so much that it wrapped the entire planet and would not settle for a very long time. The sun, which had shone on the Earth without fail for 4.5 billion years, was hidden. The world went dark, and then it went cold. This is the quiet horror of that day. And it is worth understanding, because it explains everything that followed. The asteroid did not kill the dinosaurs by striking them. It killed them by turning off the light. With the sun blocked, the plants could no longer feed on sunlight, and they began to die. The great plant-eating giants, the long-necked browsers of the treetops, had nothing left to eat, and when they faltered, the great hunters that fed on them faltered too. The whole vast web of life that had stood for 150 million years unraveled from the bottom up, in the cold and the dark, over months and years. By the time the dust finally cleared and the sun returned, the age of dinosaurs was over. The thin gray clay layer that Walter Alvarez found in the hills of Italy is, in a sense, the ash of that long darkness, settled at last onto the floor of the world. Now, in the calm after the catastrophe, let us count, slowly, the things this story teaches us about how a world survives. There are several, and we will take them one at a time, the way you might count stars as your eyes adjust to the night. The first thing we learn is that survival is never total and never even. The asteroid did not erase all life. It struck hardest at the largest creatures, the ones that needed the most food and could hide the least, and it spared, here and there, the small and the sheltered and the adaptable, in the burrows and the waters and the quiet edges of the ruined world. Small, furred creatures that had spent the entire age of dinosaurs living in the shadows, keeping low, staying out of the way, came through the long dark alive. They were our ancestors. The meek did not inherit the earth by being strong. They inherited it by being small enough to slip through the disaster. The second thing we learn is that an ending is also an opening. For 150 million years, those small, furred creatures, the early mammals, had lived in a world entirely dominated by reptiles. There was simply no room for them to become anything more. Every large role in the living world was already taken. But when the dinosaurs fell, the world emptied of giants overnight. In the long reckoning of geology. And suddenly, there was room. Room to grow larger. Room to grow bolder. Room to become something new. And into that opened world, the mammals poured, exactly as life had poured into every cleared space before. The very catastrophe that destroyed the rulers of the earth handed the planet to the creatures that would one day include us. The third thing we learn is the strangest and the most consoling. It is that the planet keeps its balance not in spite of its disasters, but partly because of them. Each great dying cleared away the old and made space for the new. The first ice age, harsh as it was the planet correcting an air grown thin. The great dying, terrible as it was, gave rise to the dinosaurs. The asteroid, cruel as it was, gave rise to us. None of this was planned. There was no one steering. There was only a world large enough and old enough and patient enough to keep finding its way back toward life, again and again. After every blow. The earth survives not because it is gentle. It survives because it is resilient, and because it has time, and because life, once it begins, is astonishingly hard to stop completely. And so, with the dinosaurs gone and the dust long settled, The next great chapter of the world could begin, the one that leads, at last, to you. In the warming, recovering world, the mammals came into their own. They spread across the open land, grew into countless shapes and sizes, took up the roles the dinosaurs had left behind. And among the many branches of this new family of warm-blooded, furred creatures, one branch, far in the future, would matter to this story more than any other. Around 6 million years ago, in what is now the continent of Africa, the earliest known members of our own deep family began to walk the earth. One of the oldest we have found has been given the name Sahelanthropus, and it was a modest creature, probably still moving about on all fours much of the time, with a brain no larger than that of other apes. There was nothing about it to suggest that its distant descendants would one day build cities and cross oceans and look out into the very space the planet was born from. It was simply another animal in a world full of animals. But it was the faint beginning of a long road. Roughly 4 million years ago, that road took a remarkable turn. Some of these early relatives of ours rose up onto 2 legs and began to walk upright, standing tall on the open ground. It is a small thing to describe and an enormous thing to have happened, because standing up freed the hands, and freed hands can carry and shape and make. About 1 million years after that, our distant ancestors made the first known tools, simple shaped stones used to break and cut and pound. They were not yet anything we would call human in the full sense, but they were beginning to change the world around them on purpose, rather than only being changed by it. After 4.5 billion years, the planet had produced a creature that could pick something up and decide to make it into something else. Then, around 800,000 years ago, came the spark that changed everything, and it is fitting. In a story so full of fire, that fire should be the turning point for our kind as well. Our ancestors learned to control flame. We do not know exactly how it happened, whether it was lightning caught and kept, or some patient accident tended into a habit. But once we had it, we never let it go. Fire gave warmth on cold nights, and safety in the dark. And most importantly, it let us cook our food, which made that food easier to eat and easier to draw energy from. Some scientists believe this is one of the reasons our brains were able to grow so large and so quickly, fed by the new richness that cooking unlocked. Around the fire, in the long evenings, our ancestors did something no creature had ever done before. They sat together and they shared, and slowly, over many thousands of years, they began to speak, and to plan, and to imagine. The mind was waking up. And think for a moment about what that waking truly meant, because it is the reason you are able to hear this story at all. For 4.5 billion years, the Earth had carried its long history in silence. The collisions and the ice ages, the first life and the great dyings, all of it had happened with no one to witness it, no one to remember it, no one to wonder why. And then, around those small fires, a creature appeared that could ask questions. Why is the sky that color? What lies beyond the hills? What happened before we were here? That curiosity kindled in the firelight. is the most remarkable thing the planet has ever produced, more remarkable in its way than the largest dinosaur or the deepest ocean, because it is the planet, after all that time, finally turning around to look at itself. Every fossil ever studied, every layer of rock ever read, every patient measurement that let us reconstruct the story we have followed tonight, grew from that first quiet spark of wanting to know. You are heir to it. The very fact that you find any of this interesting, that some part of you wants to understand where you come from, is the oldest and most human thing about you. For a long stretch, we were not alone. The world held several different kinds of human, close cousins walking the same lands, each their own branch of the same family tree. But between about 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, the other branches faded away, one by one, until only a single kind of human was left. That kind was us, Homo sapiens. Whether our cousins were outcompeted or absorbed, or simply unlucky in a changing world, the result was the same. By the end of that long winnowing, there was only one human species walking the earth, and there has been only one ever since. Every person you have ever met, every face in every crowd, every voice in every language is a member of that single surviving branch. We are, all of us, the last human standing. About 10,000 years ago, in a world freshly warmed after the last great ice age, our ancestors made another quiet revolution, perhaps the most consequential of all, for their entire history. Humans had wandered, following the herds and the seasons, taking what the land offered and moving on. But now, in a few scattered places, people began to stay. They learned to plant seeds and wait for them to grow, to keep animals rather than only hunt them, to draw a steady living from a single patch of ground. The first farmers had arrived, and when people stopped wandering and put down roots, the shape of everything changed. Villages appeared, and then towns, and then cities. With farming came surplus, and with surplus came time for things other than survival, time for craft and trade and writing and wonder. The whole towering structure of what we call civilization rests on that simple, ancient decision to stay in one place and tend the land. From there, the story you half remember from school begins to take shape. But try to feel how astonishingly recent it all is against the vast backdrop we have been traveling through for thousands of years. Human life changed slowly. Empires rose and fell. But a farmer in one age would have recognized the world of a farmer many centuries later. And then, only about 250 years ago, in the blink of a geological eye, came the great acceleration we call the Industrial Revolution. We learned to harness coal and steam and, later, the hidden energy of fuels pulled from deep in the earth, the ancient buried remains of living things from ages long past. Quiet rural societies, built around the farm and the village, transformed within a few generations into crowded, churning, industrial ones, built around the machine and the city. The pace of human change, slow for so long, suddenly broke into a run, and it has not slowed since. You can see that same acceleration in the simple count of how many of us there are. For almost the whole of human history, our numbers were small, rising slowly, often falling back in hard times. It was not until about the year 1804, after tens of thousands of years of human life, that the number of people on Earth first reached 1 billion. That is a long, slow climb. And then look at what happened next. By the year 1927, just over a century later, we had doubled to 2 billion. And since the 1960s, the climb has steepened sharply, faster and faster. Until today, there are more than 8 billion human beings alive at the same time, all of us riding this one small planet together through the dark. In the span of a single long human lifetime, our numbers have multiplied beyond anything our ancestors could have dreamed. It is worth setting that against the great clock of the planet one more time, because it is hard to feel otherwise. Remember the calendar year, where the whole history of the Earth is squeezed into 12 months. On that scale, the dinosaurs ruled for the better part of a week. The first humans appeared only in the final hour of the final day. All of farming, all of writing, every city ever built, every person you have ever heard of, fits into the last minute before midnight. And the great climb in our numbers, from 1 billion to more than 8 billion. The burning of those ancient buried forests. The warming of the air. All of it happens in the final second. In the last single tick of the year. Faster than the planet has ever known any change to come. That is not said to alarm you. It is said so you can feel, honestly, how new we are, and how quickly we have learned to touch the whole world at once. And that brings us, at the very end of this immense journey, back to the present moment, to the world as it is tonight, with you in it. After surviving asteroids and ice ages, the breaking and joining of continents, the great dyings and the long darknesses, the planet now faces something it has never faced before in all its 4.5 billion years. For the first time, the change sweeping across the Earth is being driven not by volcanoes or wandering rock from space, but by a single species living on its surface. The burning of all those ancient buried fuels has been returning long-stored carbon to the air, the same kind of warming gas that has tipped the planet's balance in ages past. And the world is growing warmer. Temperatures are rising. The seas are rising with them. And the great variety of living things, the rich web built up over hundreds of millions of years, is thinning in many places at a worrying pace. We should be honest and careful here, because this is the one chapter of the story that is still being written, and you and everyone you know are living inside it. Many who study the Earth warn that if the warming continues unchecked, we could be moving toward another of the great turning points in the history of life, another of those moments when the world reshapes itself, and much of what lives upon it is lost. This is not said to frighten you in the quiet of the night. It is said because the long story we have been following holds within it a kind of reassurance and a kind of responsibility, both at once, and it would be a shame to reach the end without naming them. Here is the reassurance. The Earth, as we have seen, is extraordinarily good at surviving. It has been through worse than anything we could do to it. Far worse. And it has always, in time, found its way back toward life. The planet itself is in no real danger of ending. Long after any trouble we might cause, the continents will go on drifting. The volcanoes will go on breathing. The oceans will go on turning. And life, hard to stop once it begins, will go on adapting and recovering as it always has. There is a deep comfort in that, and you are allowed to rest in it. The world is older and stronger than our worries. But here is the responsibility, and it is gentler than it sounds. The Earth will survive. The question that is actually open is a smaller and more human one. It is whether the particular, fragile, beautiful world that suits us, the mild climate and the steady seasons and the rich web of life that our farms and our cities and our whole way of living quietly depend upon, will remain. The planet does not need saving. We do, in a sense, along with the countless other creatures who share this brief, warm moment with us, and the same long story that tells us how much ruin the Earth can absorb also tells us, plainly, that conditions change, and that the creatures who endure are the ones who pay attention and adapt in time. We are, as it happens, the first species in the history of the planet that can see the change coming, understand it, and choose to do something about it. That is not a burden. That is an astonishing gift, 4.5 billion years in the making. So, let us pause now, before we begin to let it all go, and rest for a little while in what this whole long story might mean. Because beneath all the asteroids and the ice ages, all the breaking continents and the rising and falling of life, there is something quietly tender in it, something worth carrying with you into sleep. Think of how unlikely you are for the universe to have made a place where you could exist. A great many things had to happen, and almost all of them looked, at the time, like disasters. A cloud of dust had to collapse into a star. A young planet had to be struck so hard that part of it became the moon. The world had to cool and rain and fill with sea. Tiny creatures had to spend more than 1 billion years quietly remaking the very air. The planet had to freeze and recover. Life had to be nearly wiped out. Not once, but several times. And each time a few survivors had to carry the thread forward. The dinosaurs had to rise and rule and fall so that small furred creatures in the dark could have their turn. And out of those small creatures, after a long road through fire and language and farming, had to come a particular kind of animal that could lie in the quiet at the end of a long day and wonder about all of it. You are the universe's way of looking back at its own history. You are what 4.5 billion years of survival finally produced. And notice that nearly every gift in this story came disguised as a catastrophe. The collision that gave us the moon, the poison that gave us the air, the cold that pruned the world, and the dying that cleared it. The asteroid that ended the dinosaurs and opened the door for us. Again and again, the very worst day became, in the long unfolding, the doorway to something good. This is not a promise that all suffering leads somewhere kind. The earth is not sentimental, and we should not pretend it is. But it is a true and steadying pattern, written into the oldest rocks there are, that endings are very often also beginnings, that a thing knocked down is not the same as a thing destroyed, and that what looks like ruin from up close can look, from far enough away in time, like the turning of a page. There is comfort in that you are allowed to keep, especially on the hard nights. And perhaps the deepest lesson of all is the one about patience. Nothing in this story was rushed. The world did not become itself in a hurry. It took its time, all the time there was, billions of patient years of cooling and gathering and trying and failing and trying again. There were stretches more than 1,000 million years long in which almost nothing seemed to change. And yet beneath that stillness, the future was quietly being made. If the planet itself could afford to be that patient, then surely, tonight, you can afford to set down your own hurry for a while, whatever you are carrying, whatever feels urgent. The earth has seen far larger things rise and pass, and it is still turning, slow and patient and sure, exactly as it was when we began. Now let us gather the whole long journey together one last time, gently, so that you can hold all of it at once for a moment, and then let it drift away from you like a tide going out. It begins with a cloud, a vast, cold, drifting cloud of gas and dust in the dark between the stars, going nowhere in particular for a very long time. And then it leans inward, and gathers, and spins, and at its heart the pressure builds until hydrogen fuses into helium and a new light catches in the dark. The sun is born, and in the wheeling disk of leftover material around it, grain joins grain and clump joins clump, patiently, over ages, until the inner worlds of rock take shape, and one of them is the earth. It begins as a world of fire, molten and glowing, breathing out poisonous gases, pelted from above by the last of the falling rubble. And then comes the greatest blow. A planet the size of Mars, called Theia, striking the young Earth so hard that a ring of shattered rock wraps the sky. And from that ruin, gravity gathers our moon, the first gift wrapped in the first catastrophe. Then the long cooling. The world gives up its heat to space, slowly, with no hurry at all. until the air can hold its breath no longer and the rains come and fall and fill the low places, until a single great ocean covers nearly everything and the earth becomes a world of water. And in that warm, dark sea, about 3.7 billion years ago, something stirs that has never existed before. Life, small, simple, single specks that hold themselves together and make copies of themselves and ask nothing more. For more than 1 billion years, life stays small and quiet, and then the tiny creatures of the sea learn to catch sunlight. And as they feed, they breathe out a strange new gas called oxygen, and over unthinkable ages they fill the whole sky with it, building, breath by invisible breath, the air that you are breathing now. The cost is terrible. The old life that cannot bear the new air dies away, and the thinning of the warming gases plunges the world into a deep freeze, until much of the planet lies under ice. And then the volcanoes warm it again, and the ice withdraws, and life comes back into the light. The land rises from the sea, first in small ancient cores, then gathering into the first modest landmass, then drifting and joining into the great supercontinents, Rodinia and Pannotia, and at last the mighty Pangaea, breaking and reforming in a slow heartbeat, too vast for any creature to feel. Life grows complex. The seas fill, in the great Cambrian blooming, with strange armored creatures, the trilobites among them, crawling the warm shallows for hundreds of millions of years. The climate shifts, and the first great dying sweeps much of it away, and the survivors lay the foundation of everything after. Plants creep onto the bare land and rise into the first forests, and animals haul themselves out of the water to follow. Then comes the worst day life has ever known. In the time of Pangaea, vast eruptions flood the world with warming gases, and about 9 in 10 species are lost in the great dying, and life comes as close as it ever has to ending. But it does not end. From the survivors rise the dinosaurs, who rule the land for 150 million years. The giant Argentinosaurus browsing the treetops. The great Tyrannosaurus walking the green world as if it would last forever. And all the while, beneath their feet, Pangaea breaks apart, and the continents drift toward the shapes we know. And then, 66 million years ago, a mountain of rock falls from the sky near what is now Mexico and turns off the sun. And the long darkness ends the age of dinosaurs. We know this because a father and son, Walter and Luis Alvarez, found a thin layer of clay full of metal from space, and were doubted for 10 years, until the great hidden crater called Chicxulub was found at last, exactly where their evidence said it must be. And in the emptied world, the small furred creatures who had hidden in the shadows through all the long reign of the reptiles came out into the open and grew and spread and became the mammals. And one branch of the mammals, in Africa, about 6 million years ago, began to walk. It rose onto 2 legs and freed its hands, and made the first tools. It learned, around 800,000 years ago, to control fire. And around the firelight its brain grew, and its words came, and its mind awoke. The other kinds of human faded away, until only one was left. And that one was us. We learned to farm, and settled, and built villages and cities. And then, only 250 years ago, we learned to run the world on the buried energy of ancient life. And our numbers climbed from 1 billion to 2 billion to more than 8 billion, faster and faster, until tonight. And now, for the first time, the planet's deep balance is being tipped by a single creature, and that creature, alone in all the history of the Earth, can understand what it is doing and choose another way. That is the whole story. From a cloud of dust to a mind that can wonder about clouds of dust. And the thread that runs through every part of it, from the first fire to the last, is simply this: the Earth survives. It survives by being patient and resilient and old, and by turning even its disasters, in the fullness of time, into doorways. There is nothing in that story you need to hold on to now. You have carried it all the way through. You can set it down. You have come a long way tonight. You have traveled from a cloud of dust in the empty dark all the way to this quiet room, across 4.5 billion years. And there is nothing left to do now but rest. So let the story begin to loosen its hold. You do not need to remember the names. You do not need to keep the dates in order. Let Theia and the trilobites, the cratons and the supercontinents, Pangaea and Chicxulub, let all of it soften and blur and drift gently away, like mist lifting off water in the early morning. None of it is yours to carry. It happened long ago, and it turned out well enough that you are here. You can let it go. Let your attention come back, slowly, from the deep reaches of time, to the simple warm fact of your body resting where it is. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to solve. The day, whatever it held, is finished now, and it asks nothing more of you. You have done enough. You are allowed to set it all down. Let your breathing slow. Do not force it. Simply notice it, the way you might notice the tide, coming in and going out along a quiet shore. A slow breath in, like the sea drawing back. A slow breath out, like the wave returning, in and out, rising and falling. The same patient rhythm that has moved the oceans of this world for billions of years is moving very softly in you right now. You do not have to do anything to make it happen. It breathes itself. Let it. And let your body grow heavy. Begin with your face. Let the small muscles around your eyes go soft. Let your brow smooth out. Let your jaw loosen, and your lips part just slightly. And feel the whole face settle. the way a still pond settles when the wind dies down. Let that softness spread down through your neck and into your shoulders, and feel your shoulders drop, lower than you expected, releasing a weight you may not have known you were holding. Let it flow down your arms now, warm and slow, down through your elbows, your wrists, all the way to your fingertips, until your hands lie open and still and heavy. Let your chest soften with each easy breath. Let your back sink into whatever holds it. Let your hips, your legs, your knees grow heavy and warm, down through your ankles, all the way to your feet, until your whole body feels held and weighted and at ease, resting on the surface of a planet that has been carrying life through the dark for longer than the mind can hold. You are safe here. The world that you have been listening about, that survived so very much, is the same world holding you now, steady and sure beneath you. It carried the first faint life through the warm, primitive sea. It carried the small, furred creatures through the long darkness after the asteroid. It has carried every living thing that has ever lived, through every disaster, all the way to this moment. And it is carrying you right now, gently, through the night, asking nothing of you but that you rest. There is nothing to carry into sleep. The asteroids have already fallen, long ago, and the world went on. The ice has already come and gone, again and again, and the world went on. Every great trouble in this whole long story is finished, settled into the rock, turned into the quiet ground beneath you. And whatever small troubles belong to your own day, they too can wait until morning. They will keep. Nothing needs you tonight. You are free to simply lie here and breathe, and let the slow turning of the world rock you down into sleep. Let the breaths come slower now, a little softer each time, in and out, heavy and warm and still. You do not need to follow the words any longer. You can let my voice become just a sound in the dark, like distant water, like wind in faraway trees. Something gentle at the edge of hearing while you drift further and further down. Picture, if you like, one last quiet image as you go. The Earth, seen from very far away. A small blue and white world turning slowly against the black, wrapped in the thin bright air that countless tiny creatures spent 1 billion years making, lit on one side by the steady old sun, and on the other side, the side where you are, soft with night, no edges, no corners, no hurry, just a patient blue world, turning and turning, carrying everything that has ever lived, and you among them, gently through the dark. It has survived everything. It is still here. And so are you. There is nothing more to do. There is nothing more to know. Let the last of the story dissolve. And let the gentle weight of your own resting body be the only thing left. And let even that grow distant now. The world is turning. You are safe. You are warm. You are exactly where you need to be. Let your breathing carry you the rest of the way down, slow and easy, like a tide going out under the stars. Rest now. Sleep deeply, and let the gentle dark hold you until morning.